Hello, and welcome to our next chapter of the Christmas Mystery. It's December the 6th, and so we'll be reading the chapter for December the 6th on the journey of Elisabet and Ephiriel and Joshua and the sheep as they head off towards Bethlehem. But before we start on the chapter, let's take a look at our Advent calendar box and see what kind of character we might have in store for us today. The 6th of December. Oh, great. It's one of the wise men. So let's put him up here with the company of the pilgrimage and see if we can learn about who that might be and what they're up to. The 6th of December, you can see we have a lovely drawing of a tower of some sort. We're pretty certain to learn about what that tower is. The quote that begins the chapter is, "A camel can move from place to place as well, a bit like the castles on a chessboard." When Joachim woke up on Sunday morning, it felt as if he had just fallen asleep, for he hadn't woken once during the whole of that long night. Then he realized that he had dreamed, and as soon as he remembered the dream, it seemed to him that the night had been quite a long one after all. He had dreamt that the magic Advent calendar was filled with small chocolate figures that turned into real animals as soon as he opened the doors and let them out of prison. To stop them running away, he had to lock them up in his secret box, and he had only let them out on Christmas Eve. Then all 24 chocolate animals crept out through the window and set off through the countryside. They were going to Bethlehem, because that's where the Christ child was born. Joachim knew that Jesus had loved everyone, but in his dream, he had been fond of chocolate too. I think Jesus would have been fond of chocolate. Joachim sat up and laughed. He was ready to open the 6th door in the Advent calendar. Today there was a picture of a round tower. He would look more closely at that picture afterwards. First, he had to read what was on the scrap of paper. Caspar. When the boat with Elisabet, the angel Ephiriel, Joshua the shepherd, and the 3 sheep touched land on the Danish side of the Ore Sound, they were welcomed politely by a black man. It was Elisabet who discovered him first. The angel who was rowing sat with his back to the shore, and Joshua was busy keeping the sheep quiet. "There's a man over there," she remarked. The angel glanced over his shoulder and said, "Then he's one of us." The black man had a dark cloak with gold buttons, red woolen trousers, and sheepskin shoes. He came towards them, seized the boat, and pulled them up on land. The sheep jumped out first, and soon they were all standing on the beach. The man with the fine clothes bent down and took Elisabet's hand. "Greetings to you, my child, and welcome. I am King Caspar of Nubia." "Elisabet," said Elisabet, curtsying politely. She wasn't quite sure how to behave. Perhaps she should have said that her name was Elisabet Hansen and that she came from Norway, but that wouldn't have been very interesting just after he had told her that he was king of Nubia. "He's one of the 3 wise men from the east," whispered Ephiriel solemnly. "Or one of the kings of the Orient," nodded Joshua. None of this made the situation any easier for Elisabet. If she was going to say anything, it would have to be that she was the Princess of Toten, or something like that. Then maybe the king would have believed that Toten was a mighty kingdom. The Black King bowed again and said, "The pleasure is on my side of the Ore Sound. You should know that I've been standing here waiting for you for so long that between 1701 and 1699, I had to play hopscotch." This sounded so mysterious that Elisabet began rubbing her eyes to find out whether she was properly awake. It was difficult enough to play hopscotch between squares on the asphalt, but how could the wise man manage to play hopscotch between 2 different years? He explained in more detail. "When I arrived on this shore, in the year of our Lord 1701, some fishermen appeared, and they were so dismayed when they saw one of the 3 wise men that I had to take a step backwards. That's how I got to the year 1700. I sat down and looked out over Ore Sound, but after a couple of soldiers on horseback came from the fortress in Copenhagen. They too were somewhat dismayed to see a black king. You see, at the moment, I am the only black man in the whole of Denmark. At least, the only one who is a king of the Orient besides. That sort of thing attracts attention, my friends, for people find it difficult to get used to something completely different. So I hurried back to the year 1699, and since then I have waited here. From that time on, I have met neither man nor beast, and I have had no need to hide myself from sun and moon, nor from the stars of heaven either. For the stars are so close to God that they would never permit themselves to gossip about the life of humans on earth." Elisabet wasn't sure that she understood all this, but she did see that she was talking to a real wise man. He was so wise that she didn't quite know where to look. It was a great relief to her when at last the shepherd thumped his crook on the ground. "To Bethlehem! To Bethlehem!" The little procession of pilgrims began to move off again. The 3 sheep first, Joshua and Caspar the Black King next, Elisabet and Ephiriel last. They leapt along broad cobbled streets, and Ephiriel explained that this was Copenhagen, the king's city. It was so early in the morning that the streets were almost deserted. Elisabet thought it was a blessing to see a big city empty of cars. Instead, you had to put up with the horse droppings that were fertilizing the streets. "The time is 1648, announced the angel Ephiriel. "It's the last year of Christian IV's reign. He became king of Denmark and Norway when he was still a small child many years ago. Norway is part of Denmark at this time. Christian IV is very fond of Norway and has visited the country often. Soon they arrived at the very center of the Danish capital. They stopped in front of a church with a round tower at one end. That must be the tower from the picture. That's the round tower, which King Christian has just built onto the new Trinity Church," said Ephiriel. "The church towers look imposing, but he thought it was a pity that they should stand there to no purpose. So the round tower has been built both as a church tower and as a watchtower where astronomers can stand in peace and quiet, studying the movements of the planets and the positions of the stars in the sky. These are the days when the first telescopes are being invented. "That's a strange mixture," said Elisabet. She felt that she had to say something clever every now and again, but the wise man shook his head. "The stars are created by God too," he said, "so studying the stars in the sky can be like a whole church service. But here they have neither deserts nor camels." Elisabet stared at him, puzzled, and the wise man continued. "The best way to study the stars, in the opinion of all wise men, is to sit on the back of a camel in the desert. It's almost like sitting in a tower, but a camel can move from place to place as well, a bit like the castles on a chessboard. The only thing that's inconvenient for a camel is to go through the eye of a needle." Elisabet was not at all sure whether she agreed that the back of a camel could be compared with a church tower or a desert with a chessboard. "The drawback of a watchtower," Caspar went on, "is that it usually stands stock still. I've seen a tower that has stood in the same spot for more than 1,000 years. The old walls must get bored with the view. On the other hand, they have experienced how people have come and gone, and perhaps that has given them insight." Elisabet nodded. Caspar had even more to tell her. There are two ways of becoming wise. One way is to travel out into the world to see as much as possible of God's creation. The other is to put down roots in one spot and to study everything that happens there in as much detail as you can. The trouble is that it's impossible to do both at the same time. Elisabet was struck with wonder at the wise man's words. To be on the safe side, she clapped her hands, and the angel and the shepherd did the same. Caspar was infected by their enthusiasm and began clapping too because he was so pleased with all that had been said. Elisabet thought it must be fun to keep thinking such clever thoughts. It was as if the wise man had read her thoughts. He said, "Thinking clever thoughts is almost like being at a circus. Not a circus with clowns or elephants, but a real thinking circus. But let it be said once and for all, I am grateful to all clowns and elephants for their attention." Joshua thumped his crook on the cobbles. "To Bethlehem," he said, "to Bethlehem." The procession of pilgrims began to move along the streets again. Through the city and out to the country they went. Between swaying fields of corn and cool, leafy woodland, Denmark seemed to be extra flat. They could see no tall buildings. The only things that pointed upwards occasionally were the churches they passed, all of them built in honor of a little child who once upon a time was born in Bethlehem. They caught sight of the sea in the distance and came down to a small town called Korsar, which lay beside the Great Belt, the broad sound between Sjælland and Fyn. The people in the town almost fell over when they caught a glimpse of the astonishing procession, but their terror lasted only a short time, for the next moment the procession had moved 1 or 2 weeks backwards in the history of the town. Then there were other people who caught a glimpse of the pilgrimage for a second or two. At that time, there was continual talk of angels. Joshua pointed to a large rowing boat at the water's edge. "We shall have to borrow that," he said. "Hurry up now, it's nearly 1,600 years before Jesus' birth." And he fell to chasing his sheep on board. Elisabet felt she had to ask whether this wasn't stealing. But Ephiriel reminded her that Jesus had to borrow an ass when he rode into Jerusalem. A little later they were out on the Great Belt. The angel rowed with one oar, the black king Caspar with the other. He had to work hard in order to row as strongly as Ephiriel. When Mama came in to look at the Advent calendar, Joachim forgot that he mustn't talk about what he had read on the folded piece of paper. She leaned over the picture. "That must be the Tower of Babylon." Joachim shook his head. "Oh no, that's the round tower in Copenhagen." Mama looked at him in astonishment. "Who told you that?" "No idea," replied Joachim. That was how Mama answered him when he asked her something she couldn't tell him. It's impossible to play chess with a tower like that because it stands stock still. And if you sit inside it, you soon get bored with the view. But on the other hand, you may get some insight. Mama clasped her hands together. Joachim thought it was because he had said something clever, but all she said was, "But Joachim, where do you get all this from?" Well, we know it's part of the Christmas mystery. And that's the end of the chapter for today.